The rain in Veridia was never just rain. It was a living entity, a gray curtain that fell over the city, washing the glossy streets but never managing to cleanse the dirty secrets hidden in every dark corner. For Elara Vance, the rain was the soundtrack to her exhaustion, a steady, cold rhythm tapping against the windowpane of the cafe where she worked. 11 o'clock at night. The rich smell of coffee mingled with fresh milk and the dampness clinging to the coats of the last few customers. Elara moved behind the counter with gestures that had become mechanical after 8 hours, wiping down the espresso machine, stacking cups, a polite smile permanently fixed on her lips, hiding her heavy shoulders and the dull ache in the back of her neck. This was her second job of the day. In the mornings, she worked part-time at the city library, a quiet and pleasant place. At night, she was swallowed by the hectic pace of food service, all for Leo. The image of her little brother, his smile radiant despite being confined to a hospital bed, was the only thing that kept her going. Leo's rare genetic disease was eating away at his body and her bank account. An experimental treatment was their only ray of hope, but its cost was an astronomical figure, a mountain Elara was trying to climb day by day on her meager wages. "That's a wrap, Elara," said Sal, the kind-hearted cafe owner, his own eyes etched with a fatigue that matched hers. "Go on home and get some rest. You look like you're about to collapse." Elara gave him a grateful smile. "Thanks, Sal. I've already called a car." She untied her apron, slipped on her thin coat, and stepped outside. The damp chill of the Veridian night immediately enveloped her, making her shiver. The orange-yellow glow of the streetlights blurred in the rain, turning the puddles on the sidewalk into shimmering black mirrors that reflected the neon signs of the buildings across the street. She glanced at her phone screen. The app showed her ride had arrived. A black sedan, license plate, JXN 582. She squinted across the street. Under a dim streetlight, a sleek black sedan was parked at the corner, its engine purring softly, its headlights hazy in the rain. It looked exactly like the description. Tired and just wanting to get home quickly, Elara didn't think twice. She hurried across the street, cold raindrops lashing against her face. She opened the back door and practically fell inside, bringing the cold and the smell of rain with her. "Sorry to have kept you waiting," she said, out of breath, trying to smooth her drenched, honey-colored hair without looking up. 221 Maple Street, please." Silence was the only reply. A heavy, unusual silence. There was no soft music, no friendly driver's voice, no clicking of a meter. Instead, there was a stillness that was almost suffocating. The air in the car didn't have the familiar artificial scent, but instead smelled of expensive leather, cedar wood, and something faint and cold, like polished metal. A sense of unease crept over her, and Elara slowly lifted her head. Her heart seemed to skip a beat and then began to hammer against her ribs. The men in the driver's and passenger's seats were both wearing black suits, their large frames as silent as statues, but her gaze was locked on the man sitting in the back seat, directly across from her, separated by the spacious interior. He was the definition of darkness dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His tall, powerful frame filled the space. Thick black hair was slicked back neatly, revealing a high, intelligent forehead. His face could have been carved from cold marble, with a sharp jawline, a straight nose, and thin, resolute lips. Every feature radiated power and absolute control. But the most terrifying thing was his eyes. They were the gray of a stormy sea, cold, empty, and seeming to see straight through every thought, every fear she had. A faint scar, almost imperceptible, ran along his jawline, a silent reminder that this man was no stranger to violence. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had made a terrible mistake. "I believe." The man's voice broke the silence. It was deep, steady, and as cold as ice, each word carrying an invisible weight. "You've gotten into the wrong car." Panic erupted. I'm sorry," she stammered, her trembling hand fumbling for the door handle. "I'm so sorry. I'll get out right now." The door made a dry click. It was locked. "No need to rush," the man said, his eyes never leaving hers. His gaze was an invisible cage, tightening around her. "You're here now." Just then, out of the darkness, a black SUV with its headlights off suddenly sped toward them, cutting them off. The screech of tires on the wet asphalt was deafening. The SUV's doors flew open, and two men in black jumped out, brandishing handguns fitted with silencers. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. Before she could scream, it all happened in a flash. "Mr. Moretti, get down!" the bodyguard in the front seat yelled, drawing his own weapon. The man called Moretti moved with extraordinary speed. He showed no sign of panic. In one fluid motion, he lunged across the space, grabbed Elara by the shoulder, and yanked her down to the floor of the car. His large body completely shielded hers, his weight and warmth suddenly surrounding her, a paradoxical and terrifying form of protection. She could feel the taut muscles under the expensive fabric of his suit and hear the beat of his heart, unnaturally steady and calm in the midst of a firefight. The sharp crack of gunfire erupted, dry and deadly. The window beside her spider-webbed with cracks. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face against the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. All she could hear were the short bursts of fire, the clang of metal, and the heavy breathing of the men around her. The shootout ended as quickly as it began. When silence returned, only the steady drumming of the rain on the car's roof and the acrid smell of gunpowder remained. "Area secure," the bodyguard's voice announced, tense but in control. Dante Moretti, known to Veridia's entire underworld by one fearsome name, Il Re. The king slowly sat up. He glanced through the shattered window, where the two attackers lay crumpled on the wet asphalt, before his icy gaze returned to Elara. She was still curled up on the floor, trembling in terror. As she looked up, she met his gray eyes, which held not a ripple of emotion. He looked at her not as a terrified human being, but as an unexpected variable, a problem that needed to be solved. "Well," he said, his low voice the only sound in the car. "It seems your night has just become significantly more complicated." Elara looked into his eyes and knew one thing for certain. Her normal life, with its money worries and exhausting shifts, had officially ended the moment she opened that wrong car door. She had unwittingly stepped into the king's domain, and in the cold Veridian rain, she wasn't sure she would survive to see the dawn. The car sped through the night, leaving behind crimson puddles and two bodies growing cold in the Veridian rain. Inside, the air was even thicker than the silence outside. Elara sat huddled in the corner of the seat, trying to regulate her breathing. Shock and adrenaline made her body tremble uncontrollably. She could feel tiny shards of glass in her hair and on her clothes. The pungent smell of gunpowder still lingered, a horrific reminder of what had just happened. Dante Moretti sat perfectly still, like a statue. He had taken out a black silk handkerchief and was slowly wiping a small splatter of blood from the back of his hand, an act so calm it was chilling. He didn't look at her, but his presence filled the entire space, cold and oppressive. Finally, Elara found her voice, though it was weak and shaky. "Take me home, please." "Impossible," Dante replied instantly, his voice flat, without a hint of hesitation. He put the handkerchief away, as if he'd just cleaned up a trivial spill. His decisiveness sparked a wave of defiance in Elara, overpowering her fear. "Why not? I won't say anything. I swear. I didn't see anything. I just want to go home to my brother. He's waiting for me." Dante finally turned to look at her. In the passing streetlights, his gray eyes glinted with a sharp coldness. "Your silence is worthless, Miss Vance. They saw your face. To Marcus Thorne, you are a loose end that needs to be silenced. Or worse, you're a tool he can use against me. In either case, your outcome is the same." Every word he spoke was a stark, cold truth, shattering her fragile hopes. The car wasn't heading toward her rundown apartment complex. Instead, it turned onto a private road, climbing into Veridia's most exclusive hills, where massive villas hid behind high walls and dense trees. The car stopped in front of a modern penthouse tower, a structure of glass and black steel reaching for the night sky, looking more like a high-tech fortress than a home. "You'll be staying here," Dante commanded as a bodyguard opened the car door. "No," Elara protested, shrinking back into her seat. "I can't. My life, my jobs, my brother." "Your life changed the moment you stepped into my car," he cut in, his patience apparently wearing thin, "and I am your only chance of survival." He stepped out of the car and looked at her, offering no threat, but his gaze was more frightening than any weapon. "The choice is yours. Trust me and live, or walk out of here and face the Viper clan on your own." Elara knew it wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. She took a deep breath, trying to still her trembling, and reluctantly stepped out of the car. They entered through a private entrance and a personal elevator that went straight to the penthouse. When the elevator doors opened, Elara's breath caught. The penthouse was breathtakingly vast. Polished black marble floors reflected the city lights from the massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The interior was minimalist, with expensive furniture in shades of black, gray, and white. Everything was perfect, orderly, and soulless, just like its owner. The sparkling city of Veridia stretched out below like a carpet of diamonds, but from this height, it looked distant and silent. She could see her entire world, yet she was completely cut off from it. "Gianfranco will show you to your room," Dante said, shrugging off his suit jacket and draping it over a chair. "Take a shower and change. There are clothes in the closet." "I don't want any of this," Elara said, her voice a mixture of anger and despair. "I want my life back." Dante turned and walked toward her. Though he kept his distance, she could feel the cold aura radiating from him. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice becoming low and calculated. "I had my people run a check on you. Elara Vance, 24 years old, orphan, working 2 jobs to pay for the medical treatments for your brother, Leo Vance, who suffers from combined immunodeficiency." Elara was stunned. He knew. He knew everything in such a short amount of time. "That is why I'm making you an offer, not a demand," he continued. "You will stay here, under my protection, as my guest. You will follow every rule I set and remain completely silent about everything you've seen. Do not try to contact the outside world. Do not try to escape. He paused, letting his words sink in. In return, he said, and this was the killing blow, the Onyx Syndicate will cover all of Leo's medical expenses, not just his current treatments, but the best experimental therapy in the world. We will bring the best doctors to him. Your brother will have a chance at a healthy life. Elara's world tilted on its axis. He was offering her the one thing she craved most, the thing she had sacrificed her health and youth to pursue. But the price was her own freedom. He wasn't just protecting her, he was buying her. He was using her love for her brother to chain her to him. Tears began to well up, tears of helplessness, anger, and a sliver of guilty relief. Leo would be saved. That was the only thing that mattered. I agree, she whispered, each word a knife twisting in her pride. Good, Dante nodded, his expression unchanging. To him, this was just a business transaction. Gianfranco, the large bodyguard, stepped forward. This way, miss. Elara followed like a zombie. The guest room was larger than her entire apartment, with a king-sized bed, a luxurious bathroom, and a walk-in closet already filled with designer clothes. The window was another massive glass wall, overlooking a different angle of the city. When Gianfranco left, leaving her alone in the opulent silence, Elara walked to the window. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, staring down at the distant lights. She had gotten what she wanted for Leo, but she had lost herself. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage. A gilded cage built of steel, where she was the captive canary, and her warden was the King of Veridia's underworld. The first few days in Dante Moretti's penthouse passed in a tense silence. For Elara, it was the silence of a cage. No matter how splendid, it was still a prison. She had everything she could possibly need at her fingertips: gourmet food, expensive clothes, books, movies, but she lacked the one thing she truly wanted: freedom. She spent her time exploring her new residence, always under the watchful eye of Gianfranco or another bodyguard. The penthouse was a labyrinth of cold luxury. There was a state-of-the-art gym, a home theater, and a massive library with leather-bound books that looked as if they'd never been touched. Everything was perfect, sterile, and soulless. It felt more like a museum than a home, and Elara felt like just another exhibit recently added to the collection. Meanwhile, Dante seemed to barely notice her presence. He was a ghost in his own home, disappearing into his office early in the morning and only emerging for dinner. He was always dressed in immaculate suits, exuding an aura of power and control, even when simply reading reports on a tablet. Their dinners were a silent Cold War. They sat at opposite ends of a long ebony dining table, the space between them filled with unspoken words. "Is the food to your liking?" he would often begin, his voice flat, less a question, and more an assertion that everything had to be perfect. "It's fine," she would reply, her tone equally cool. "But I prefer to cook for myself." He raised an eyebrow. "The kitchen has a private chef." "I know, but I'm not used to being served, and I'm not used to having dinner with my kidnapper," she said bluntly, looking him directly in his gray eyes. A ghost of a smirk touched Dante's lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but a reluctant acknowledgement of her spirit. "I didn't kidnap you. I'm protecting you." "There's a very fine line between protection and imprisonment, Mr. Moretti," she retorted. He didn't argue further. Her defiance seemed to intrigue him more than it angered him. In Dante's world, people either feared him or flattered him. Elara did neither. She looked at him as an equal, even though the balance of power was tipped completely in his favor. Her stubbornness was a vibrant spark in his sterile world. After nearly a week of feeling like she was going insane with boredom and uselessness, Elara decided she had to change the situation. She couldn't just sit around and wait. She was not some princess locked in a high tower. Gathering all her courage, she marched straight to his office door and knocked. Without waiting for a response, she opened it and walked in. Dante was standing in front of the glass wall, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his phone to his ear with the other. He was speaking in Italian, his tone sharp and authoritative. When he saw her, he gestured for her to sit in the leather chair opposite his desk and quickly ended the call. He put his phone down and settled into his chair, lacing his fingers together. "What is it?" "I want to work," Elara declared, her voice firm. He looked at her, a rare flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Work? Yes. I can't just sit around like this. I'm going crazy. I need something to keep my mind busy. Anything." Dante leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You are my guest. Guests don't need to work." "I already told you, I'm not a guest. I'm a prisoner," she said plainly. "But even prisoners have jobs. Besides, you're paying an enormous amount of money for my brother. At least let me do something so I don't feel like a complete freeloader." Her logic was strange, yet it made sense. Dante considered the offer. Keeping her busy might make her less trouble. Besides, he was curious to see how this intelligent and resilient woman would handle being exposed to even a small fraction of his empire. "What can you do?" he asked. "I'm good with filing and organization. I worked in a library. I can handle basic bookkeeping. I'm a fast learner," she listed off, as if in a job interview. He thought for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. There's a backlog of records for one of my front companies, a textile import business. You can start by organizing and digitizing them. He stood up, went to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick stack of documents. That desk in the corner is yours. Start tomorrow, 8 o'clock sharp. But remember this, Elara, he said, his voice turning serious. Everything you see, everything you hear in this room, is absolutely confidential. One word gets out, our deal is terminated, and so is my protection. I understand, she said, feeling a small but significant victory. The next day, Elara began her new job. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of purpose. She immersed herself in the numbers, invoices, and shipping schedules. The work helped her temporarily forget her circumstances. It also gave her a glimpse into how Dante ran his business, with meticulous, precise, and ruthless efficiency. Her presence in the office completely changed the dynamic between them. They were no longer kidnapper and victim sitting across from each other at dinner. Now, they were two people working in a shared space. Sometimes, she would catch him watching her work, his gaze no longer entirely cold but holding a hint of curiosity. And Elara, watching the man who ran an entire underworld from his desk, couldn't help but admit a disturbing truth. Behind the monster was a brilliant mind. The war between the king and the rebel girl was far from over, but the battlefield had now shifted from a direct confrontation to a more complex chess game, where every move held unexpected possibilities. Chắc chắn rồi. Đây là bản dịch các chương tiếp theo của câu chuyện sang tiếng Anh Mỹ. Working in the same space as Dante was a strange experience. Elara gradually grew accustomed to his presence, to the steady rhythm of his typing, to the low timbre of his voice as he gave orders over the phone in a smooth but cold Italian. The work gave her a purpose, a necessary distraction, but it also inevitably drew her closer to him. She began to notice the small details, the way he would gently rub his temples when stressed, the way he always kept a small, silver-framed photograph on his desk, always face down, and the way he would sometimes gaze out the window at the city of Veridia, his eyes distant as if looking into a haunted past. The real change happened one late autumn night, when a violent storm slammed into the city. Veridia in a storm was a sight both magnificent and terrifying. The wind howled through the skyscrapers, and massive bolts of lightning repeatedly tore across the night sky, illuminating the entire city in ghostly white flashes. Thunder boomed, the sound reverberating off the penthouse's glass walls, making the entire building seem to tremble. Elara had never liked storms. They always reminded her of the fateful night her parents died in a car crash, also during a torrential downpour. Tonight, that sense of unease was even stronger. Being trapped at the top of a skyscraper in the midst of nature's fury made her feel small and vulnerable. She was curled up on a sofa in the library, trying to read but unable to focus. Gianfranco had informed her that Dante had a meeting outside and would be home late. She had assumed she would have a quiet evening to herself. But around midnight, at the peak of the storm, the library door opened. Dante walked in, drenched. Rainwater clung to his coat, and his black hair was plastered to his forehead. He didn't look like the untouchable king he usually was. There was something different in his demeanor, a tension, an instability she had never seen before. He said nothing, just went straight to the minibar in the corner of the room and poured himself a glass of whiskey. His hand, usually so steady, seemed to have a slight tremor. An exceptionally loud bolt of lightning struck somewhere very close, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The entire penthouse shook. The lights flickered for a moment before coming back on. Elara flinched, reflexively clutching the book to her chest. When she looked over at Dante, she saw him standing motionless, his back to her, one hand gripping the edge of the bar. His shoulders were tense. "Are you okay?" she blurted out, her concern overriding her usual caution. Dante didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, seemingly trying to regain his composure. "It's just a storm," he said, his voice hoarser than usual. But Elara knew it was more than that. She could see it in the way he stood, in the tension radiating from him. She remembered what he had said about his own parents dying on a stormy night. Her own pain suddenly connected with his in an unexpected way. She gently set her book down, got up, and walked to the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned with a steaming cup of chamomile tea, its soft fragrance filling the air. She placed the cup on the small table next to where he was standing. "My mother used to make this for me whenever there was a storm," she said softly. "She said it helps calm the nerves." Dante turned to look at her, his gray eyes dark and filled with emotions she couldn't read. He stared at the teacup, then back at her, an internal struggle playing out within him. To accept this kindness meant admitting to a weakness, something he had spent his entire life burying. Finally, he let go of the bar and picked up the cup. The warmth from the mug seemed to spread to his cold fingers. He didn't say thank you, but he drank it, a silent acceptance that meant more than words. They stood in silence for a while, with only the sound of the rain lashing against the glass and the wind howling outside. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was filled with a shared understanding, an empathy born from similar tragedies. The next day, The atmosphere between them had changed. The invisible wall of ice seemed to have thawed slightly. That afternoon, while reorganizing some bookshelves in the office at Dante's request, Elara accidentally knocked over a small wooden box hidden behind a row of law books. The box sprang open, its contents spilling onto the floor, a few faded old photographs and a stack of children's drawings. She bent down to pick them up. One photo showed a man and a woman smiling radiantly, looking very much like Dante, the photo from his desk. Next to it was a clumsy drawing in crayon of 3 stick figures holding hands under a sundae. Underneath, in a child's handwriting, were the words, Mama, Papa, Dante. Elara's heart clenched. This was his lost world. The little boy who drew this picture, the boy who lived in the sunshine, had been killed the same night as his parents, leaving behind a man who knew only darkness. What are you doing? Dante's ice-cold voice came from the doorway. Elara started, scrambling to her feet, the drawings still in her hand. He stood there, his face a stone mask, his eyes dark with anger. The crack in his armor she had seen last night was now perfectly sealed, even stronger than before. I'm sorry, she stammered. The box fell. I didn't mean to. Put them down, he commanded, his voice as sharp as a razor. She hurriedly placed his precious mementos on the desk, feeling as though she had committed an unforgivable sin. He walked into the room without a glance at her, silently gathered the photos and drawings, carefully placed them back in the box, and put it away. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, he just completely ignored her, and that silence was more painful than any punishment. He had shown her a crack in his soul, and when she had accidentally touched it, he had slammed the door shut. But Elara couldn't forget what she had seen. She had seen the boy, Dante. She had seen the pain behind the king's cruelty, and she realized a dangerous truth. She no longer just feared Dante Moretti. She was beginning to sympathize with him. And in his world, sympathy could be a fatal weakness. For several days after the incident in the library, a wall of ice stood between Elara and Dante. He became colder and more distant than ever, speaking to her only when absolutely necessary, the exchanges brief and strictly work-related. Elara knew she had crossed an invisible line and felt a pang of regret, but at the same time, what she had seen, his pain, his tragic past, had completely changed how she saw him. Everything changed on a Wednesday morning, when Dante made a sudden announcement over breakfast. We're going out this Saturday night, he said, his eyes fixed on his tablet. Elara was so surprised she almost dropped her fork. Out? Where? An annual charity gala. At the Veridia Museum of Art, he explained, finally looking up at her. My presence is required to maintain a public image, and I won't leave you here alone without supervision. The thought of leaving the penthouse after weeks of confinement made Elara's heart race, to breathe outside air, to be among other people. But her excitement was quickly replaced by anxiety. Appearing in public as Dante Moretti's companion, who would she be in their eyes? As if reading her mind, he added, You'll be introduced as my new business associate. Dress well, smile, and say little. The presence of a beautiful stranger at my side will keep people busy speculating. It's the perfect distraction. Elara realized that to him, this wasn't a date. It was a strategic move, and she was a pawn in his game. Despite a flicker of disappointment, she nodded in agreement. Anything was better than being locked in this gilded cage. On Saturday afternoon, a series of boxes from the most high-end fashion brands were delivered to her room. Inside were gowns, shoes, and jewelry. Dante had sent a professional stylist to help her prepare. Elara felt like a doll being dressed up for display. After much deliberation, she chose an emerald green evening gown. The dress was simple yet exquisitely elegant, the soft silk clinging to her body, accentuating curves she never knew she had. Her honey-colored hair was swept up into an elegant chignon, revealing her slender neck and a pair of sparkling diamond earrings. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the person staring back. She was no longer the tired waitress or the plain librarian. She was a strong, mysterious woman. When she descended to the main hall, Dante was waiting. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that made his tall frame seem even more imposing. His black hair was slicked back, and his gray eyes seemed darker, deeper than usual. When he saw her, there was a subtle shift in his expression. His gaze swept over her, an undeniable appreciation and a flash of possession in his eyes. Green suits you, he said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped closer and offered his arm. Let's go. Elara hesitantly placed her hand on his. His skin was warm and firm, a strange contrast to his cold demeanor. The Veridia Museum of Art was resplendent under crystal chandeliers. The city's elite were gathered in full force, a sea of people in lavish attire, the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses echoing through the main hall. The moment Dante and Elara entered, a brief but noticeable silence fell over the room. All eyes turned to them. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like an undercurrent. Who was the woman with Ilri? Elara felt her cheeks flush under the weight of hundreds of curious gazes. Instinctively, she straightened her posture. Dante seemed completely unaffected. He moved with absolute confidence, a king striding through his own palace. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture both protective and proprietary, and leaned in to whisper in her ear, his warm breath sending a shiver down her spine. Relax. Head up. You're with me. Throughout the evening, Dante introduced her to politicians, CEOs, and other powerful figures. Elara played her part flawlessly, smiling gracefully and answering questions intelligently but vaguely. She realized this was Dante's battlefield, where wars were waged with fake smiles and veiled words. Across the crowded room, she caught the eye of a man. He was tall, striking, with blonde hair and a navy blue suit. He had a charming smile, but his eyes were as cold as a snake's. He raised his glass to Dante in a gesture of greeting that was laced with challenge. "Who is that?" Elara asked quietly. Dante's body tensed. The hand on her waist tightened slightly. "Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice dropping a few degrees. "Leader of the Viper clan." Elara's heart sank. This was Dante's enemy, the man who had ordered the attack on their car, the one who had thrust her into this situation. His presence made the air around them feel thick and heavy. As the band began to play a slow, seductive waltz, Thorne audaciously made his way directly toward them. "Moretti, what a surprise," he said, his smug smile never faltering. His eyes raked over Elara shamelessly. "And this must be the reason you've been keeping such a low profile lately. Might I have the honor of a dance with this beauty?" Before Elara could react, Dante took a small step forward, positioning himself between her and Thorne. "She's dancing with me," Dante declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took Elara's hand and led her to the dance floor, pulling her into his arms. Their bodies were pressed close, one of his hands resting firmly on her waist, the other holding hers tightly. Elara could feel the strong beat of his heart through his shirt, and his subtle, masculine cologne enveloped her. They moved to the music, a silent, tense dance. To the outside world, they were a powerful and glamorous couple, but to Elara, it was a wordless confrontation. Dante's eyes never left Thorne, who stood just off the dance floor, watching them with a cryptic smile. "Don't ever look him in the eye," Dante commanded, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "He'll take it as an invitation." "I wasn't planning on it," she replied, trying to keep her own voice steady. They continued to dance, lost in the music and in their own world. Gradually, Elara ceased to notice the people around them. She could only feel Dante's strong arms, his confident lead, and the way their bodies moved in perfect harmony. His gaze finally left Thorne and focused on her. In those gray eyes, for the first time, she didn't see coldness or anger, but a smoldering fire, a well-hidden desire. When the music ended, he didn't let her go immediately. The room seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, caught in a powerful and dangerous pull. "We're leaving," he said, his voice husky. They left the gala in silence, leaving a wake of whispers and curious stares behind them. But something had irrevocably changed between them on that dance floor. The dance hadn't just been an act, it was an acknowledgement of an undeniable connection, a dangerous dance on the edge of passion. Tonight, in the arms of the king, Elara had realized that her cage might not only be made of steel, but gilded with an emotion even more terrifying than captivity. After the gala, the atmosphere in the penthouse subtly shifted. The dance under the chandeliers had broken some invisible barrier between Elara and Dante. The silence between them was no longer heavy with hostility, but filled with a new awareness of each other, a tension of a different color, more intimate and more dangerous. Gazes lingered a little longer, and the times they accidentally brushed past each other in the office seemed to send a jolt of electricity between them. Neither of them acknowledged it, but they couldn't ignore it either. Dante allowed Elara more freedom within her gilded cage. He let her video call Leo every day, instead of only occasionally as before. Seeing her brother happier and healthier in a comfortable hospital room, receiving the best treatments, Elara felt a reluctant gratitude toward the man who had taken her freedom. Life was ironic. She tried to bury her complicated feelings in her work. She had finished organizing the stack of shipping records, and Dante, impressed with her efficiency, gave her a new task: to review and cross-reference old financial statements for several subsidiary companies. It was meticulous work, well suited to her experience as a librarian. One afternoon, while searching for some archived documents at Dante's request, Gianfranco brought her the last few boxes of belongings from her old apartment. Most of it was small things, old books, photo albums, a few keepsakes. She sat down on the living room floor and opened each box, a wave of nostalgia for her normal life washing over her. At the bottom of the last box, beneath some old yearbooks, was a small, dark wooden box. It was her father's box. After he passed away, she had kept it but had never really looked closely inside. Her father had been a quiet, private man, and this box seemed to be where he kept the things that mattered to him. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened the lid. Inside were a few personal items: his old wristwatch with its worn leather strap, his favorite fountain pen, and a few old portraits of her mother. And lying at the very bottom was a small, brown, leather-bound ledger, old and familiar. Her father was an accountant, and she was all too familiar with the sight of him hunched over ledgers like this one. Out of curiosity, she opened the book. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with columns of numbers and handwritten notes in a system of shorthand that only he understood. It appeared to be a record of transactions for a particular client. She flipped through a few pages, not really understanding much. It was probably just one of his old work files. She was about to close the ledger when a line on the very last page caught her eye. It was different from the other notes, written in red ink and carefully circled, like an important reminder. Project Onyx. Elara's heart seemed to stop for a second and then began to pound in her chest. Onyx, as in the Onyx Syndicate. It couldn't be a coincidence. Veridia was a big city, but that name was too specific. A chill ran down her spine. Her father, a humble accountant, a gentleman who knew only numbers and his family. What could he possibly have to do with a notorious criminal organization? The accident. The report said he lost control of the car in the storm. But her father was an extremely careful driver. He never sped, especially in bad weather. The doubts she had tried to bury for years suddenly resurfaced with a vengeance. Was it possible his death wasn't an accident? She quickly hid the ledger under her sweater just as she heard Gianfranco's footsteps, her heart racing. Her mind reeled with 1,000 questions. She had to find out the truth. From that moment on, Elara began her own secret investigation. She worked harder during the day, but at night, when Dante had retired to his private quarters, she would sneak onto the computer in the office. She searched for any information she could find about her parents' accident, rereading old articles and brief news reports. Everything was very vague. A tragic accident due to bad weather. No witnesses. The case had been closed with strange speed. Then, she returned to the ledger. She couldn't understand the numbers, but she could recognize names and dates. She began to cross-reference them with the company documents Dante had given her. She spent many nights, her heart pounding with the fear of being discovered, comparing every name, every transaction date, and then she found it, a name that repeated in both her father's ledger and Dante's files. Veridia Maritime Solutions, a shipping company. In her father's ledger, transactions with this company abruptly stopped a week before he died. In Dante's files, this company was noted as having been restructured and acquired by a parent company owned by the Onyx Syndicate just 2 weeks after his death. Elara leaned back in the chair, feeling a deathly cold. This was no coincidence. Her father had known something. He had gotten too close to some dangerous secret involving the Onyx Syndicate, and perhaps he had paid for it with his life. And the man who now held her life in his hands, the man for whom she was beginning to have complex feelings, was the leader of that very organization. The echoes of the past were screaming in Elara's ears, and they were telling a horrific story. She was living in the house of the man who might be connected to her father's death. Fear, suspicion, and a burning desire for revenge began to smolder within her. She looked toward the closed door of Dante's room, and for the first time, she saw him not as a captor or a protector, but as a potential enemy. Chắc chắn rồi. Đây là bản dịch các chương tiếp theo của câu chuyện sang tiếng Anh Mỹ. The horrifying discovery created an invisible chasm between Elara and Dante. She continued her work mechanically, a smile still on her face when she video chatted with Leo, but inside, a storm of suspicion, fear, and anger was raging. Every time Dante looked at her, she wondered if his gray eyes hid the secret of her father's death. Did he know? Or worse, was he involved? She became quiet and distant, and the change did not go unnoticed by Dante. He was a predator, a master of observation and analysis. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided his gaze, the way she flinched whenever he entered a room unexpectedly. One evening, after a dinner that passed in dead silence, he stopped her as she was about to leave the table. "What's wrong, Elara?" he asked directly, his voice leaving no room for evasion. "You've been different these past few days." Elara's heart hammered. What could she say? Confess that she suspected him of being involved in her father's death? That was tantamount to suicide. "It's nothing," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just feeling a little tired." Dante didn't buy it. He could see through her lie as easily as looking through glass. He stepped closer, and she reflexively took a step back. That small action said it all. She was afraid of him again. But this time, it wasn't the fear of prey before a predator. It was more complicated. He stopped, an unreadable expression flashing across his face. "You don't have to be afraid of me." "Really?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "You're Dante Moretti. This entire city is afraid of you. Why should I be the exception?" Instead of anger, Dante looked weary. He turned away and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city at night. "Because fear is a tool, Elara, and I have no reason to use it on you." He was silent for a long moment, staring at the distant lights. "Everything I do, everything I've become, has a reason." Elara stood still, unsure whether to leave or stay. Something in his voice, a well-hidden vulnerability, kept her rooted to the spot. "Do you want to know why I built this empire?" he asked suddenly, still not turning around. Do you want to know why the name Moretti sows terror? She didn't answer, but her silence was an affirmation. I was 16, he began, his voice low and steady, as if recounting a story from another life. My family wasn't at the top. My father, Antonio Moretti, was an influential man, a respected captain within the syndicate, but he was a man of principles. He believed in honor and loyalty. Dante poured himself a glass of liquor but didn't drink, just swirled the amber liquid in his hand. It was a stormy night, just like the night you and I met. There was an important meeting at our home, about a new business deal. My father trusted his brothers in arms, especially my uncle, his younger brother. He paused, taking a deep breath. I was in my room, eavesdropping like any curious kid. I heard arguing, then gunshots, just 2 shots. Elara brought a hand to her mouth, her chest tightening. When I ran downstairs, he continued, his voice turning cold, devoid of all emotion. My father was on the floor of his study. My mother, who had tried to shield him, had collapsed beside him. The ones who shot them were the men my father considered family. They did it for greed, for power. And your uncle? Elara whispered. Silvio. Dante said the name like a curse. He stood there, looking at me, not with remorse, but with calculation. He claimed it was an attack by a rival gang, that he had tried to save them. Ablet-en-lit. He turned to face Elara, and for the first time, she saw the raw pain in his eyes, a pain that had been compressed for years, forged into a cold fury. I survived that night only because I was too young to be considered a threat. They sent me to a boarding school in Europe, thinking I would forget. But I didn't. I never forgot. I spent every day planning. I built connections, amassed power, and waited for my moment. He walked toward her, his eyes blazing. When I returned to Veridia, I didn't just take back what was mine. I tore their old world apart. I rebuilt the Onyx Syndicate in my own image. Efficient, ruthless, and with no room for betrayal. Every single one of our enemies paid the price. That blood debt, I paid it in full. His confession hung in the air, heavy and tragic. Elara finally understood. His cruelty wasn't his nature. It was a weapon forged from tragedy. His empire wasn't built just on power, but on revenge. He had put on the cloak of a monster to hunt other monsters. Her suspicion of him was still there, but now it was shrouded in a fog of deep empathy. The man standing before her wasn't just the head of the Onyx Syndicate. He was also a 16-year-old boy who had been forced to watch his world crumble, and as she looked into his eyes, she realized another terrifying truth. His blood debt may have been paid, but his war wasn't over, and somehow, she and the story of her father's death seemed to be intrinsically linked to that war. Dante's confession left an indelible mark on Elara's mind. The story of the 16-year-old boy who witnessed his family's murder complicated all her feelings. Her suspicion remained, but it was now wrapped in a thick layer of empathy. She no longer knew how to face him. She couldn't sleep that night. Dante's words echoed in her head. His father's name, Antonio Moretti, the story of betrayal, and the name of the man he hated most, his uncle, Silvio. Silvio. The name was like a key, unlocking a door she was both terrified and eager to step through. She snuck out of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. The penthouse was dark and quiet. She crept into the office, where moonlight streamed through the glass wall, casting a dim glow on the room. She took her father's ledger from its hiding place. Her hands trembled as she turned to the last few pages. Before, she had only looked for company names. Now, she was looking for a person's name, and then she saw it. It wasn't written clearly. Her father, a careful man, had used shorthand. Next to a series of suspicious transactions related to Veridia Maritime Solutions, there was a small note in the margin, S.M. Risk. Just below it was another line. Must inform A.M. S.M. Silvio Moretti. A.M. Antonio Moretti. Elara's breath caught. Everything fit together with a terrifying perfection. Her father hadn't just accidentally worked for a company connected to Onyx. He had known. He had known Silvio was a threat, and he had intended to warn Dante's father. His death wasn't an accident. It was a murder to silence him. The anger and grief she had suppressed for years erupted with violent force. She was no longer afraid. She was filled with a burning desire for the truth. She clutched the ledger in her hand. It was no longer an old memento, but a piece of evidence, a weapon. She didn't wait until morning. She went straight to Dante's bedroom and knocked, the raps urgent and fierce. A few seconds later, the door opened. Dante stood there, wearing only a pair of black pajama pants, his muscular torso and a few faint scars on display. His hair was tousled, and his gray eyes regarded her with surprise and annoyance. "What is it?" "My father," Elara said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "He knew your uncle." The sleepiness vanished from Dante's face instantly, replaced by sharp focus. He led her into the room and closed the door. "What are you talking about?" Elara didn't answer. She handed him the ledger, her trembling finger pointing to the last page. "Look, S.M. Silvio Moretti, A.M. Antonio Moretti." And Veridia Maritime Solutions. It's all here. His last entry was made a week before he died. Dante took the ledger, his eyes scanning the words rapidly. Silence filled the room as he processed the information. His face became a mask of stone, but Elara could see a storm brewing in his eyes. He flipped back a few pages, reading the numbers, the notes she couldn't decipher. Richard Vance, Dante said suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. He looked up at her, and his eyes held a shocking recognition. Your father was Richard Vance. Yes, Elara replied, confused by his reaction. How did you know? Because he was my father's personal accountant, Dante said, and the words hit Elara like a lightning bolt. He was one of the few men my father trusted completely. Dante set the ledger down on a table, but his eyes never left it. He pointed to a column of numbers. These aren't normal business transactions. This is money being systematically siphoned from company accounts. Silvio was embezzling for months. He was using the money to build his own power base and collude with outside enemies. He pointed to her father's note. Must inform AM. My God. Richard, your father discovered everything. He was trying to warn my father. And then, the final, horrifying, and devastating truth became clear to them both. His death, Elara began, her voice breaking, was no accident. Dante finished, his voice cold and filled with hatred. They killed him to silence him before he could speak. Your father's death was the first shot in that coup. My parents were next. The room fell silent. The truth was too immense, too cruel to be absorbed at once. Elara and Dante, two people from completely different worlds, were bound together by the same tragedy, the same traitor. She wasn't an innocent bystander caught in his world. Her fate had been sealed years ago, in the same act of betrayal that had taken both their families. Elara looked at the man before her. He was no longer her captor, nor just her protector. He was the missing piece of her life's tragedy. An unwilling companion on a path to justice she never knew she had to walk. Grief, loss, and a terrifyingly shared purpose erased all the lines between them. They were no longer the king and the rebel. They were two orphans, created by the same crime, and they had the same enemy. The horrifying truth hung in the chilled air of the bedroom, an invisible ghost binding two strangers together with the threads of tragedy. The initial shock subsided, leaving a hollow silence. For Elara, the grief over her father's death, buried for so many years, now resurfaced, more potent and vivid than ever. It wasn't a random accident of fate. It was a crime. The tears she had held back finally fell. She sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs, not of fear, but of profound pain and outrage. Her father's ledger slipped from her hands, lying open on the expensive carpet. Dante stood motionless for a moment, watching the woman breaking down before him. His cold armor seemed to crack. Her pain was an echo of his own, the pain of the 16-year-old boy who had lost everything on a stormy night. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel, instead of just react. He walked over silently, not as the powerful Il-Rey, but simply as Dante. He crouched down beside her, said nothing, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm and comforting. It wasn't an act of pity, but of solidarity. Elara looked up at him, her eyes blurry with tears. She saw in his gray eyes not coldness, but a familiar darkness, a shared pain. She was no longer alone in her tragedy. On an inexplicable impulse, she leaned forward and buried her face in his shoulder. Her sobs now choked and unrestrained. Dante stiffened for a second, unaccustomed to such closeness and emotional vulnerability. But then, he slowly brought his other arm up, holding her in an awkward but sincere embrace, letting her release all her grief. In that moment, in the arms of the man who had been her captor, Elara felt safer than ever before. When her sobs subsided, he gently helped her to her feet and led her to an armchair. He poured her a glass of water and a stiff drink for himself. What do we do now? Elara asked, her voice raw. Now, Dante said, his voice regaining its sharp edge. We turn this pain into a weapon. The power dynamic in the penthouse had shifted. Elara was no longer a prisoner in need of protection. She was the key holder, the living witness to Silvio's first crime. Her father's ledger was the foundation for a revenge Dante never knew he needed to complete. Silvio is cunning, Dante explained, pacing the room like a caged animal. He's built a respectable, loyal image over the years. Many captains in the syndicate respect him. If I simply accuse him based on an old ledger, it will start a civil war. They'll think I'm trying to purge the ranks to consolidate my power. So we need more proof? Elara said, her mind starting to work again. Exactly. We need undeniable proof. Proof of his connection to Marcus Thorne. Proof of his current illegal activities. Your father's ledger is the treasure map. It tells us where to start digging. A common goal was set. Their grief quickly crystallized into a steely resolve. In the following days, Dante's office became their war room. They worked together from morning until late at night, hunched over the old ledger. Elara, with her meticulous mind and eye for detail, deciphered more of her father's notes. Dante, with his extensive knowledge of the underworld and Onyx's operations, connected those clues to reality. This forced proximity forged a new bond between them. They shared meals that were no longer silent, but filled with discussions of their next steps. They argued, they planned, and sometimes they shared memories. My father loved roses, Elara recounted during one break, a sad smile on her face. He had a small rose garden behind our house. He said the numbers he worked with were so dry, he needed a little beauty to balance things out. My father liked to sail, Dante responded, his voice distant. He said the sea was the only place he felt truly free, unbound by the rules of our world. These small moments of sharing built a fragile bridge of trust between two wounded souls. They saw the real person in each other, not the roles the world had forced them to play. The emotional trust began to bleed into physical attraction. One night, as they were examining an old shipping map, their heads bent close together. Elara could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell his familiar, masculine scent. When she looked up to say something, she found him already looking at her, his gaze no longer on the map. The space between them seemed to vanish. His eyes dropped to her lips, and he slowly leaned in. Elara's heart raced. She leaned toward him as well, drawn in by an irresistible force. But just as their lips were about to touch, Dante stopped abruptly and pulled back. He closed his eyes for a moment, an internal struggle clear on his face. "We can't," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not now. It's too dangerous. It would be a weakness Silvio and Thorn could exploit." Elara felt a sharp pang of disappointment, but she understood his reasoning. He was right. They were in the middle of a war, and distractions could be fatal. She nodded, trying to hide her turmoil. "You're right. We should focus on the work." The moment passed, but it left an indelible mark. Dante's refusal wasn't a rejection, but a form of protection. He wasn't just thinking of himself, but of her safety. They returned to their work, but a new, hungry awareness hung between them. The trust they shared may have been fragile, but it was being steadily reinforced by respect, understanding, and a newly ignited flame of passion. They knew the road ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time, they felt they weren't walking it alone. Chắc chắn rồi. Đây là bản dịch các chương tiếp theo của câu chuyện sang tiếng Anh Mỹ. The investigation had transformed the penthouse from a gilded cage into a secret command center. Elara and Dante worked tirelessly, their minds merging toward a single objective, exposing Silvio. Elara's father's ledger had become their guide. Every scribbled note, every seemingly meaningless number, was a potential clue. They had made small breakthroughs, identifying a few shell corporations and old bank accounts Silvio had used. But all those trails had gone cold. Silvio was an old fox. He had covered his tracks perfectly after the coup years ago. They needed something current, irrefutable proof of his ongoing betrayal. They seemed to be hitting a dead end. Frustration began to creep in. One evening, when both were exhausted, Elara sat alone in the office, staring at the last page of the ledger. She had read it 100 times. S.M. Risk. Must inform A.M. But there was a string of numbers next to it they hadn't been able to decipher. 14298. Dante had assumed it was a container number or some kind of account, but all attempts to trace it had failed. Elara stared at the numbers, and suddenly, a memory surfaced. "My father had a very strange habit," she said softly, thinking she was alone in the room. Dante emerged from the shadows in the corner, a glass of water in his hand. "What habit?" Elara jumped. "He used my mother's birthday for everything. Passwords, lock combinations. He said it was his lucky number." She looked back at the sequence. "My mother was born on February 14th, 1968, but my father never wrote out all 4 digits of the year. He always just used the last 2. She took a pen and wrote it down. 14268. It didn't match. Maybe not. She sighed in disappointment. Dante stepped forward, looking over her shoulder. "Wait, your father was an accountant. Maybe it's not a date. Maybe it refers to a property." He took the ledger, his gray eyes narrowing. 14298. Block 14, Pier 2, Warehouse 98. That's one of our old warehouses in the Southern Port District. Veridia, Maritime Solutions, used to operate out of there. A jolt of electricity passed between them. It was a long shot, but it made terrifying sense. "That warehouse has been abandoned for years," Dante said, his mind already working at lightning speed. "No one pays any attention to it. The perfect place to hide secrets." He didn't waste a second. He pulled out his phone and called a man named Nico, his tech specialist. Their conversation was brief and filled with technical jargon, but Elara got the gist. Dante was ordering Nico to hack into the port's old security system, searching for any recent, unusual activity around Warehouse 98. The wait was agonizing. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Elara worried for their safety. Dante was planning his next moves. A few hours later, Dante's phone rang. He put it on speaker. "Mr. Moretti." Nico's voice came through. "You were right. The official security system shows nothing, but I accessed the backup logs of a private internet provider in the area. There's a military-grade encrypted Wi-Fi signal broadcasting from Warehouse 98, active intermittently for the past 6 months. It's connected to a server in the Cayman Islands. Can you get in? Dante asked, his voice like ice. It's tough, but nothing's impossible. Give me another hour. That hour felt like an eternity. Finally, an email arrived on Dante's tablet. Nico had done it. Dante opened the attachment. The screen lit up, displaying what they had been searching for. It was an encrypted data cache. Inside were bank statements from a Cayman account, showing regular payments from a shell company owned by Silvio Moretti to another shell company in Marcus Thorne's name. But that wasn't all. There were also leaked shipping manifests from the Onyx Syndicate, detailed information on arms shipments, electronics, and premium liquor shipments that had been mysteriously hijacked over the past few months, costing Dante millions. Silvio wasn't just colluding with Thorne. He had been actively sabotaging his own organization from within. It was the irrefutable proof. The snake was revealed, not just in the past, but in the present. Elara looked at Dante. His face was emotionless, but she could see the fury churning in his gray eyes. It wasn't an explosive anger, but a lethal stillness. For years, he had lived believing he had avenged his parents. But now, he realized the true traitor had been beside him all along, playing the part of a loyal uncle, a trusted advisor. That betrayal was more painful than the bullets that had killed his parents. He closed the tablet, the sound snapping shut in the quiet room. Elara, he said, and for the first time, he spoke her name, not as a warden or an unwilling partner, but with a raw sincerity. Thank you. Without you, I never would have found this. He stepped in front of her, gently raising a hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. It was a brief touch, but it held everything that couldn't be said. Gratitude, trust, and something far deeper. Then he stepped back, and Ilray returned. Now we have our weapon, he declared, his voice cold as steel. It's time to plan the war. The investigation was over. The next, far more dangerous phase, was about to begin. They were no longer just seekers of truth. Now, they were the hunters. Once they had the proof, Dante Moretti's war machine began to operate with lethal precision. The exhaustion and uncertainty of the investigation vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. His office transformed into a situation room where he, Elara, and Gianfranco mapped out every detail of the plan. We can't be rash, Dante said, moving pieces across a marble chessboard, a metaphor for the players in his scheme. Killing Silvio quietly will only sow suspicion and fear. It would make him a martyr in the eyes of some. His betrayal must be exposed in the light, for all to see. His plan was audacious. He would call an emergency meeting with all the high-ranking captains, capos, and advisors, consigliere, of the Onyx Syndicate. The reason for the meeting? Gianfranco asked, his stoic face serious. To discuss our recent losses, Dante replied, a cold smile touching his lips. I'll say I've found a mole leaking information to the Viper clan. I'll let Silvio think he's safe. Maybe even let him participate in the hunt for himself. The trap was perfect. Silvio, in his arrogance, would never suspect he'd been discovered. He would walk straight into his own execution, completely unaware. The chosen location was a high-end Italian restaurant owned by Dante, a place where security could be completely controlled. What about me? Elara asked, her voice firm. What's my role in this? Dante turned to her, his gaze softening noticeably. Your role is to stay here, in this penthouse, where you are completely safe. You've done more than enough, Elara. The rest is on me. No, she objected, standing to face him. This is my fight too. Silvio killed my father. I can't just sit here while you go and claim justice for both of us. I want to be there. Absolutely not, Dante growled, his protective instincts flaring. It's too dangerous. I can't focus if I'm worried about your safety. Their argument was intense, but in the end, Elara had to concede. She knew her presence could become a liability, his weakness. She agreed to stay, but on one condition. He had to promise he would come back safe. That promise hung between them, heavy with unspoken words. The days leading up to the meeting passed in a suffocating tension. Everyone acted normally, but beneath the surface, a deadly plot was being set. Dante continued his daily business, and Silvio continued to play the loyal uncle. Elara felt like she was living in a play where only a few people knew the ending. The night before the meeting, the tension peaked. No one could sleep. The entire tower seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the coming storm. Elara found Dante standing alone on the balcony, looking down at the glittering city of Veridia. The night wind ruffled his black hair, and his silhouette looked solitary against the vast universe. She walked silently to stand beside him. What are you thinking about? She asked softly. About the price of power, he answered, his voice low and distant, and about what my father would say if he saw me now. He would be proud of you, Elara said with conviction. You're doing the right thing. You're protecting his legacy. Dante turned to her, the silver moonlight casting his angular features in soft relief, smoothing his hard edges. His legacy was nearly destroyed. You were the one who helped me find it again, Elara. You brought light into the darkest corners I didn't even know existed. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He gently raised his hand to her face, his thumb brushing lightly across her lips. I said we couldn't, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. I said it was too dangerous, that you would be my weakness. He looked deep into her eyes, his own gray ones burning. I was wrong. You're not my weakness. You're my strength. The final defensive wall Dante had tried to keep around, his heart crumbled completely. He stopped fighting it. He leaned down and kissed her. The kiss wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was fierce, searing, and full of longing, as if all the tension, fear, and passion that had been suppressed for weeks had burst forth in a single moment. Elara wrapped her arms around his neck, returning his kiss with equal fervor. In that moment, there was no king and no prisoner, no Onyx Syndicate or Viper clan. There were only two people, two damaged souls finding solace and strength in each other before facing a battle for their lives. He swept her into his arms and carried her to his bedroom. That night, they belonged to each other completely, their love unspoken but expressed in every touch, every kiss. They found a quiet, passionate peace in the eye of the storm, an affirmation of life and love before facing the darkness of tomorrow. The next morning, dawn broke over the city. Elara woke up in Dante's arms. The tension of the night before was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. They didn't speak much. Everything that needed to be said had been said. As Dante dressed in his battle suit, Elara helped him with his tie. Their hands touched, a silent connection. Before he left, he held her face in his hands and placed a kiss on her forehead. I'll be back, he promised. Elara watched his and Gianfranco's backs disappear as the elevator doors closed, her heart filled with both love and a heavy dread. The trap was set. Now, they just had to wait for their prey to walk into it. Time in the penthouse seemed to freeze. Elara paced the vast living room, its silence now more terrifying than any noise. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. She checked the clock, imagining the scene unfolding at that fancy restaurant. Dante was facing the wolves in his own pack. Would they believe him? Was Silvio cunning enough to turn the tables? 1,000 worst-case scenarios ran through her mind. She hugged herself, trying to ward off the anxiety tightening its grip on her chest. She trusted Dante. She trusted his intellect and his strength, but in his world, even the smallest mistake could be paid for in blood. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Her heart leaped into her throat. She snatched it up, hoping it was news from Gianfranco, but the screen showed an unknown number. She hesitantly answered. Hello? Is this Miss Elara Vance? A frantic woman's voice asked. This is Nurse Mary from Veridia Mercy Hospital, Pediatrics. A cold dread washed over Elara. Yes, this is she. Is something wrong with Leo? Is he okay? We're not sure, the nurse said, her voice trembling. Two men just burst into his room. They said they were family, sent by Mr. Moretti to transfer the boy. Our security tried to stop them, but her voice broke. There was a shooting. They've taken Leo, Miss Vance. They've kidnapped your brother. Elara's world shattered. A ringing filled her ears. The phone slipped from her hand, falling onto the soft carpet. No, it couldn't be. Leo was the one person who was supposed to be uninvolved. He was supposed to be safe. Dante had promised, but this wasn't Dante's doing. She realized that instantly. This was a counter-move, a desperate gambit. Just then, her phone rang again. This time a video call, an unknown number. Shaking, she picked it up and accepted the call. The handsome but smug face of Marcus Thorne filled the screen. He was sitting in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. He smiled, a smile that made her blood run cold. Hello, beautiful, he said, his voice as smooth as velvet but laced with venom. I believe you just received some bad news. He panned the camera to the side. Elara let out a horrified gasp. Leo was tied to a chair, his hands and feet bound. He looked terrified but was trying to be brave, his wide eyes staring at the camera. Beside him stood a large goon, a gun in his hand. Let him go, Elara screamed, tears streaming down her face. What do you want? Money? I'll give you everything. Oh, we don't want your money, Elara, Thorne sneered. This is a message for your king. Silvio Moretti is a valuable business partner of mine, and I don't like my partners being disturbed. He just sent me a panicked message, said Dante is exposing him as we speak. He leaned close to the camera, his snake-like eyes boring into her. Here's the deal. You have that old ledger, the final piece of evidence. You're going to bring it to me, alone, and you're going to call Dante, tell him you're in danger, and make him call off his meeting and come save you. If you don't, your little brother gets a bullet in his head. You have 1 hour. The call ended, leaving Elara in a deathly silence. She was in an impossible situation. If she called Dante, she would ruin his plan. Silvio would get away, and Dante could be killed in the ensuing chaos. The vengeance for her father, for his parents, would be lost. But if she did nothing, Leo would die. Panic and despair washed over her. But then, in the midst of the emotional storm, a cold resolve took hold. She was no longer the weak waitress she used to be. She had lived in Dante's world. She had learned to think like him. She would not let Thorn and Silvio win. She would not let Dante fail. And she would certainly not let her brother die. She wouldn't call Dante. But she would go. Action was the only option. She ran to the office and grabbed her father's real ledger. This was what they wanted. This was her bait. Now the problem was getting out. Dante had left 2 guards at the door with strict orders not to let her leave. She couldn't fight them. She had to outsmart them. She ran into the bathroom, turned on the water, and splashed it on her face. She messed up her hair, her eyes already red from crying. Then she took a deep breath and let out a blood-curdling, grief-stricken scream. The 2 guards immediately burst in. "Miss Vance, what's wrong?" "Leo," she sobbed, collapsing to the floor. "The hospital just called. He took a turn for the worse." His heart stopped. "I have to go. Please, I have to go now." Her performance was perfect. The fear and desperation in her eyes were real, just for a different reason. The guards looked at each other, confused. Dante's orders were clear, but faced with a woman in agony over her dying brother, they were only human. "We can't," one of them said, but his voice wavered. "Then come with me," she pleaded. "Just take me to the hospital. I'm begging you." Their hesitation was all she needed. While they were debating, she saw a heavy flower vase on a nearby table. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she grabbed it and swung it with all her might at the head of the closer guard. He crumpled to the floor. The other was stunned for a split second, and that was her opening. She bolted out the door, ran to the private elevator, and frantically jabbed the button. The elevator doors slid shut just as the remaining guard regained his senses and gave chase. She was out, alone, clutching the ledger, her heart beating like a war drum. She was walking straight into the lion's den. She knew it could be a one-way trip, but for Leo and for Dante, she was willing to risk it all. Desperate gambits weren't just for villains. Chắc chắn rồi. Đây là bản dịch các chương cuối của câu chuyện sang tiếng Anh Mỹ. Part 1. At the restaurant La Scogliera, the air in the private dining room of La Scogliera was thick with tension. The 12 most powerful men of the Onyx Syndicate sat around a long table, their faces grim. Cigar smoke hung in the air, but it couldn't mask the suspicion in their eyes. Dante Moretti sat at the head of the table, as cold and imposing as an emperor. He had just finished his initial presentation, summarizing the heavy losses the Syndicate had suffered in recent months. "These hijackings were not random," Dante declared, his voice echoing through the room. "They were too precise, too efficient. The enemy knew our schedules, our routes, and the exact contents of our shipments. We have a rat in our house." Murmurs erupted. The captains looked at one another, their skepticism and worry palpable. Silvio Moretti, sitting at Dante's right hand, was the first to speak. He slammed his hand on the table, his face a mask of outrage. "Unbelievable. A disgusting betrayal. Dante, my boy, you must find this rat and tear him to pieces." Dante looked at his uncle, his gaze cold and unreadable. "Oh, I will, uncle." He gave a signal, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. "This is what my tech specialist found. An unusual flow of money, laundered through shell companies, and eventually ending up in a Cayman account." Silvio began to feel uneasy, but he maintained a calm facade. "And the owner of that account," Dante continued, pausing for dramatic effect, "is none other than a known business associate of Marcus Thorn." All eyes turned to Silvio. The confidence on his face began to crack. "And this," Dante said, his voice dropping to a terrifying growl, "is the proof of who has been funding that account." He was about to have Nico display the bank statement with Silvio Moretti's name on it, the kill shot that would end it all. But just then, the phone in Gianfranco's pocket vibrated on silent. He glanced at the screen. The color drained from his face instantly. He rushed to Dante's side and whispered in his ear, "Sir, it's a message from the penthouse. Miss Vance has escaped. There are signs of a struggle. The hospital just confirmed. Leo has been kidnapped." Dante's world collapsed in an instant. The entire plan, the entire, carefully calculated revenge, it all became meaningless. He understood immediately. This was Silvio's move, a contingency plan. When he felt cornered, he had called Thorn. And they had targeted his only weakness, Elara. He understood the horrifying choice she must have faced, and he understood that she had chosen to sacrifice herself to protect his plan. She hadn't called him. She had walked into her own death trap. A primal rage, more violent than anything he had ever felt, erupted in his chest. It burned away all plans, all calculations, leaving only one objective: save her. He shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward with a bang. Everyone in the room flinched. Dante was no longer looking at the screen. He was looking directly at Silvio, and in his gray eyes was the promise of death. "The meeting is over," he declared, his voice as cold as the depths of hell. He drew the silver pistol hidden in his jacket and slammed it on the table, the barrel pointed directly at Silvio. "You're getting old, Silvio, and your last move was pathetic." Without waiting for a reaction, he turned to the captains. "Silvio Moretti is the traitor. He sold us out to the Viper clan, Anyone who stands with him, dies with him. Anyone who stands with me, lives to fight. He didn't need to say more. The truth and the fury in his eyes said it all. Gianfranco, have our men surround this place. Don't let him escape, Dante commanded. Nico, listen to me. Find Elara Vance's phone location. Now. Mobilize everyone. Tear this city apart if you have to. We're leveling any place they're holding her. The Onyx Syndicate's war machine had been activated. The quiet coup had turned into an open war. The storm had well and truly broken. Part 2. At the southern port district, Elara drove the car she had hijacked from a bystander to the abandoned warehouse district at the port. The rain had started again, heavy drops lashing against the windshield like the city's tears. She parked a short distance from Warehouse 98 and approached on foot. The place was desolate and terrifying. Rusted metal buildings stood silent in the dark, the wind whistling through broken windows, creating eerie sounds. This was where her father's story had ended. She hoped it wouldn't be where hers and Leo's story ended too. She took a deep breath, clutched the ledger to her chest, and pushed open the heavy metal door of the warehouse. Inside, a few dim overhead bulbs illuminated a vast, dusty space. Marcus Thorne sat on a wooden crate, clapping slowly. Very brave, he said. I must admit, I'm impressed. A dozen of his goons were scattered throughout the warehouse, guns at the ready, and in the middle, tied to a chair, was Leo. Leo! Elara cried out, and started to run toward him, but two thugs blocked her path. Elara, Leo called, his voice full of fear, but he wasn't crying. Let him go, Thorne. I brought what you wanted. Elara held up the ledger. Very good, Thorne said, standing up and walking toward her. He snatched the book from her hand and flipped through it. Such a small book to cause so much trouble. Now, for the next part of our deal, call Dante. No, Elara said, looking him straight in the eye. Thorne raised an eyebrow. No, I brought the book. Now you let my brother go. That was the deal. She was trying to buy time, though for what, she didn't know. Thorne laughed, a cold, grating sound. You naive little girl, you're in no position to make demands here. He gave a signal. The goon next to Leo pressed his gun to the boy's temple. Leo flinched. Elara felt her heart squeeze tight. I'll ask you one last time, Thorne growled, his smile gone. Call Dante, or watch your brother die. Elara looked at Leo's terrified face, then at Thorne's evil eyes. She knew she was out of options. Her trembling hand reached into her pocket for her phone, but just then, from outside, a series of screeching tires cut through the night, followed by the roar of powerful engines. Bright headlights from a dozen vehicles pierced through the grimy windows, flooding the warehouse with light. Everyone froze. The main door of the warehouse was smashed in by an armored SUV. Dozens of men in black, armed to the teeth, poured in from all sides, moving with professional coordination, and leading them, striding through the ruined doorway like a god of vengeance, was Dante Moretti. His eyes were ablaze, and the silver pistol in his hand was aimed directly at Marcus Thorne. Thorne! Dante roared, his voice drowning out the storm outside. You just made the last mistake of your life. Chapter 14. The Price of Atonement. The moment Dante Moretti stepped into the warehouse, time seemed to stand still. The rage radiating from him was more intense than the storm outside. A cold, deadly aura that made even the most hardened thugs shiver. Marcus Thorne was the first to break the silence. He laughed, a hoarse, falsely confident sound. Moretti, you always did love a grand entrance, but you're too late. You've lost. Lost? Dante bellowed, and that was the signal. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Dante's men, highly trained, moved like ghosts, taking cover and opening fire with cold precision. Thorne's men, though more numerous, were chaotic and panicked. The crack of gunshots echoed in the vast warehouse, muzzle flashes tearing through the darkness. Wooden crates splintered, and metal was pierced by stray bullets. Amidst the chaos, Dante had only one target. He didn't join the firefight. He moved straight forward, the silver pistol in his hand barking out decisive shots, taking down anyone in his path. He was a whirlwind of destruction, and the eye of the storm was Elara and Leo. Thorne, realizing he had lost control, grabbed Elara, pressing his gun to her head. Stop, Moretti. One more step and the girl dies. Dante froze, his eyes glowing with a deadly fire. Seizing the opportunity, Elara acted. She was not a passive hostage. She had learned too much. She stomped her heel down hard on Thorne's instep. He yelled in pain, his grip loosening for a split second. It was all she needed. Elara jabbed her elbow back into his ribs and lunged forward, breaking free. Leo, run, she screamed, shoving her brother toward a stack of nearby crates for cover. Thorne's fury erupted. Bitch! He aimed his gun at her, but Dante was already moving. He charged like a panther, not to shoot, but to tackle his enemy. He slammed into Thorne, sending them both tumbling to the floor. Thorne's gun skittered away. The fight became primal and brutal. No more guns, only fists and hatred. Dante, fueled by a rage born from the threat to Elara and Leo, had the upper hand. He delivered powerful, precise punches, each one carrying the weight of vengeance, and the fear of losing the woman he loved. Thorn, though a seasoned street fighter himself, was quickly overwhelmed. He staggered back, blood pouring from his mouth and nose. But in that moment, one of Thorn's last men, wounded but not dead, struggled up from behind a pillar. He shakily raised his gun, aiming it straight at Dante's back, who was completely focused on Thorn. "Dante, look out!" Elara screamed. Without a moment's hesitation, she ran, with no thought for her own safety, knowing only that she couldn't let him die. She shoved Dante hard to the side. Bang! The bullet tore through the air where Dante had just been. But it wasn't harmless. Elara cried out in pain and collapsed, a dark red stain spreading across the shoulder of her shirt. The entire warehouse seemed to fall silent. Dante turned and saw her on the floor. A feeling of absolute horror and loss washed over him, worse than the night he lost his parents. His world shattered once more. The rage inside him vanished, replaced by something colder, more terrifying, a lethal calm. He turned to look at Thorn, who was stunned by the scene. Dante no longer saw him as a rival. He saw him as something to be erased. Gianfranco, who had just taken down the last man, yelled, "Mr. Moretti," but Dante heard nothing. He lunged at Thorn with a final brutal assault, and the fight was over quickly. When everything was silent, with only the sound of the falling rain and heavy breathing, Dante rushed to Elara's side. He knelt, gently lifting her head. "Elara," he called, his voice breaking, his fear raw and exposed. "Elara, look at me. You're going to be okay." She opened her eyes, a weak smile on her pale lips. "See?" she whispered. "I told you, I'm not your weakness." "No," he said, tears he thought had long since dried up beginning to fall. "You're my everything." Gianfranco ran over, a radio in his hand. "Sir, Silvio has been dealt with at the restaurant. It's over." But for Dante, that battle no longer mattered. His decades-long quest for revenge had ended not with a victory, but with the fear of losing his future. The price for Silvio's and Thorn's crimes wasn't their lives. The price, almost, had been Elara's. Leo ran to his sister's side, sobbing. Dante took off his jacket, pressing it firmly against Elara's wound to stop the bleeding. He had paid the blood debt for his parents, but he had also created a new debt, a debt of gratitude to the woman who had saved his life. His atonement wouldn't be to continue living in the shadow of his past. His atonement would be to build a future worthy of her sacrifice. "Get her out of here," he roared at his men. "Get the best doctor, now." He lifted Elara into his arms, as gently as if she were the most precious thing in the world. As he walked out of the ruined warehouse, leaving the bodies and a blood-soaked past behind, he knew he had found something more important than revenge. He had found his soul, and he would do anything, pay any price, to keep it safe. A week after that stormy night, Elara woke up in a room flooded with morning sunlight. This wasn't her guest room, but Dante's master bedroom, a vast space in shades of gray and navy blue, now softened with warmer touches. A vase of fresh flowers on the table, her favorite books on the nightstand. The pain in her shoulder was just a dull ache, a reminder of the price they had paid. Her wound hadn't been deep, but Dante had insisted on bringing the best medical team to the penthouse to care for her, turning the place into a comfortable private hospital. He hadn't left her side, personally tending to her with a gentleness she never thought he possessed. Ilre seemed to have vanished, leaving only Dante, a worried, attentive Dante, who would stay up all night just to make sure she slept soundly, who would patiently feed her soup spoonful by spoonful when she was too weak to eat on her own. Leo was here too. He had been brought to the penthouse right after the rescue, and was being treated like a prince. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced by an admiration for Dante. He was now sitting by her bed, reading an adventure story to his sister, his clear voice, the best medicine for Elara's soul. When Elara woke, Dante was sitting in an armchair in the corner, quietly watching her. Seeing her eyes open, he smiled, a genuine, warm smile that lit up his angular face. "Hey," he said softly, walking to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Much better," she replied, her voice still a little weak. "Where's Leo?" "He's playing video games with Gianfranco." "I think Gianfranco is losing," he said, a spark of amusement in his eyes. This peace was strange, precious, but Elara knew they couldn't hide from the outside world forever. How are things out there?" she asked, a little anxiously. Dante sat on the edge of the bed, taking her hand. "Everything is settled. Silvio is dead. The captain saw the truth and are completely loyal. The remnants of the Viper clan are being cleaned up. The Veridia underworld has a new order." He looked deep into her eyes. "A better order." He told her about his plans, about gradually shifting Onyx's operations toward more legitimate fields, investing in technology and real estate. "I've lived in the dark for too long, Elara," he said. "You showed me there's still light. I want to build a world where you and Leo can be safe." Elara's heart swelled with emotion. But there was one last question, one final fear. "So, what are we now, Dante?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The deal is over. The enemies are gone. My brother is safe. I have no reason to be here anymore. Dante squeezed her hand tighter. He shook his head. No, Elara, you have every reason to stay. If you want to. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. I paid the blood debt for my parents, but that revenge turned me into an empty man, a lonely king on a cold throne. I thought that was all I had. He turned back, and in his gray eyes was a raw sincerity, a vulnerability he no longer hid. Then you showed up. You stumbled into my car, into my life, chaotic and stubborn. You didn't fear me. You challenged me. You saw through the monster and found the man inside. He walked back to her, kneeling by the bed so their eyes were level. I can't go back to the life I had before, Elara. I don't want to. The blood debt is paid. Now, I just want to build a new life. A life with you. The deal is over, he repeated. Now it's a choice. Your choice. You can leave, start a new life wherever you want. I'll make sure you and Leo have everything you need. Or, he took a deep breath, you can stay. Stay with me, not as a prisoner or a partner, but as my everything. Build a future with me. Tears of happiness rolled down Elara's cheeks. This was what she had longed to hear. I was never really your prisoner, Dante, she whispered, raising a hand to caress his face. My heart was captive from the moment you shielded me in that car. I love you, the real you. She leaned down and kissed him, a kiss no longer filled with desperation or fear, but only with love, acceptance, and the promise of a future. A few days later, when Elara could walk again, they stood together on the balcony at dawn. The rain had stopped. The Veridian sky was unusually clear and bright. The city below was slowly waking, bathed in the golden sunlight of a new day. Dante stood behind her, his arms wrapped protectively around her waist. Elara's injured arm was in a sling, a symbol of the battle they had won together. The city looks different in the morning, Elara said, leaning her head against his chest. Everything looks different, Dante whispered in her ear. When you're here with me. He turned her around and kissed her gently. As they looked at each other, they didn't just see the person they loved. They saw survival, redemption, and a new beginning. Their past was written in blood and darkness, but their future, like the dawn rising over the city of Veridia, was filled with light and hope. They had paid a heavy price, but in the end, they had found their home in each other's arms.